Do you remember those lost desserts that once filled African American kitchens with sweetness and pride? The ones tucked into old cookbooks or carried only in memory, from sticky molasses candies to coconut pies that graced holiday tables. These recipes turned scraps and simple staples into celebration, feeding families with resilience and love. How did we let those desserts slip away, and isn't it time to bring them back? Sweet potato pone.
Today, I've got a great sweet potato recipe to share with y'all. Also, February is National Sweet Potato Month. We're going to make sweet potato pone.
Picture this. You've got a sweet tooth, but no fancy pantry, no delivery apps, and certainly no rows of brightly packaged snack cakes at the gas station. What you do have is a sack of sweet potatoes, some sugar, if you're lucky, maybe a splash of molasses, and the kind of ingenuity that comes from generations who knew how to turn scraps into celebration. That's where sweet potato pone was born. Sweet potato pone isn't pie, and it isn't quite pudding. It's something in between, a spiced, grated sweet potato bake that held a sacred spot on African American tables from the days of enslavement through the Jim Crow South. Imagine grating sweet potatoes until your arms ached, folding them together with fat, a hint of spice, and just enough sweetness to feel indulgent, then baking it low and slow until it transformed into a caramelized, sticky-edged slab of comfort. Some versions leaned custardy, others dense and almost cake-like, depending on the family, the region, and the ingredients on hand. What makes pone more than just food is the emotional resonance. It was often tied to Sunday dinners, holidays, and gatherings where the dessert meant not just full bellies, but shared memory. Aunties and grandmothers carried the recipe in their heads, not on cards. Children would sneak bites straight from the pan, and grown folks would argue, light and fluffy or dense and chewy, as though kitchen preferences were a matter of theology. Today, sweet potato pone has largely faded behind its flashier cousin, the sweet potato pie. TikTok loves a pie tutorial, but seldom spares a thought for the humble pone. Yet in its simplicity and soul, pone represents survival and sweetness carved from scarcity. It deserves a revival, not for nostalgia's sake alone, but because it still tastes like home. Cornmeal tea cakes. If you grew up in the South, chances are someone's grandmother had a tin of tea cakes tucked away, waiting for little hands to sneak one when no one was looking. But these weren't the fluffy, frosted cookies you see on Pinterest today. Cornmeal tea cakes were humbler, grittier, and richer with history than any glossy dessert ever could be. They came from the ingenuity of enslaved African American cooks who worked with what they had: cornmeal, a little sugar, fat, and maybe an egg if the chickens were feeling generous that week. The result was a cross between a cookie and a biscuit, tender, yet sturdy, sweet, but not indulgently so. They were made to last a few days on the counter, to be dunked in coffee or milk, or handed to a child as both a treat and a filling snack. In many communities, they were the freedom cookies, made and sold by freed Black women after emancipation to earn their first independent income. Imagine the courage and sweetness of that. A handful of cornmeal, pressed flat on a pan, becoming both sustenance and survival. Tea cakes carried a quiet kind of nostalgia, the kind you taste more in memory than in sugar. They weren't made for special occasions only. They were the everyday sweet, the dessert of resilience. Families passed them down not in cookbooks, but through ritual, watching mama roll the dough, hearing the scrape of the spoon in the mixing bowl, smelling that golden warmth spread through the house. And today, cornmeal tea cakes rarely make an appearance outside of church homecomings or carefully preserved family reunions. They've been overshadowed by mass-produced cookies and Instagram-worthy desserts. But for those who remember, biting into one is like stepping into history, soft and gritty all at once, sweet enough to taste survival. Molasses stack cake. Once upon a time in the hills of Appalachia, where money was scarce and molasses flowed thicker than maple syrup, there was a dessert that could turn an ordinary gathering into a celebration. The molasses stack cake. It wasn't just food, it was a story story baked in layers, often quite literally contributed one layer at a time by friends and family. Weddings in Black Appalachian communities especially made it famous. Each guest might bring a layer, and the bride's family would stack them high, binding the whole tower together with spiced molasses or apple butter. It was dessert as community theater, proof that you didn't need wealth to have abundance, you just needed neighbors. The cake itself was simple, though not without effort. Thin, almost cookie-like rounds made from flour, lard, baking soda, and of course, dark molasses. They were sturdy and plain on their own, but once you stacked them with sticky, tangy sweet filling and let them rest, magic happened. The layers softened, absorbing the richness until the whole cake transformed into something tender, spiced, and decadent. Though never flashy, it was a dessert that demanded patience. No instant gratification here. Molasses stack cake carries an emotional weight heavier than its layers. It was a dessert of survival during times when sugar was too expensive, when fruit preserves stretched the season, when community itself was the sweetest ingredient. Families remembered who made the best layers, who brought the thickest apple butter, who sliced it with care so everyone got a taste. Today, it's almost forgotten, overshadowed by wedding cakes that cost more than an old Chevy. But the stack cake endures in memory as a testament to frugality and fellowship. In a way, it was the first collaborative bake. Move over, potluck brownies. This was communal baking before hashtags molasses pole candy. There was a time when candy didn't come in shiny wrappers or with cartoon mascots. If you wanted something sweet, you made it yourself. And in African American households across the South, that often meant molasses pole candy. It wasn't just a treat, it was a whole event, a Sunday afternoon spectacle that turned kitchens into sticky playgrounds and family gatherings into communal laughter. Molasses, cheaper and more accessible than refined sugar, was the backbone of countless desserts, but here it became something magical. Boiled down with butter until it reached the hardball stage, the thick syrup was poured onto greased plates to cool just enough before the real work and the real fun began. Making molasses pole candy was half recipe, half endurance test. Once the molten syrup could be handled, everyone who dared got their hands in. You'd pull and fold, over and over until the dark brown mass lightened into a golden, glossy rope. The more you worked it, the shinier and chewier it became. Children would squeal as their arms ached, while parents gave wry warnings about not burning fingers. It was a candy that demanded both patience and participation, a dessert that required family as much as it required ingredients. For many, the taste of that first bite, sweet, smug, and just a little tangy from the molasses, was inseparable from the sound of laughter echoing in the kitchen. It wasn't store-bought perfection. It was sticky and imperfect, strands stretching across counters and mouths, proof that joy doesn't need polish. Today, molasses pole candy has nearly vanished, replaced by bags of taffy at the gas station, but the old tradition lingers in memory, a reminder that sometimes the sweetest desserts are the ones made with your hands, your people, and a whole lot of laughter. Watermelon rind preserves. When summer rolled around and watermelons hit the table, most people thought the story ended once the sweet pink flesh was gone. But in African American kitchens, nothing went to waste, not even the rind. What others tossed away became the base for one of the most resourceful and quietly beautiful desserts of the past: watermelon rind preserves. Stripped of its hard green skin, the pale rind was chopped into chunks, then simmered slowly with sugar, lemon, and warm spices until it turned translucent and jewel-like. What was once scrap became treasure, sweet and fragrant enough to spread on biscuits, swirl into cakes, or spoon straight from the jar. This was more than frugality. It was philosophy. Enslaved cooks, and later generations living through Reconstruction and the Great Depression, knew how to coax flavor from what others ignored. Watermelon rind preserves symbolized resilience, proof that sweetness could be found even in the most overlooked places. Families would gather to peel and chop together, turning the labor into ritual. Rows of mason jars cooling on the counter weren't just food. They were insurance against leaner days, bright bursts of summer sealed tight for the cold months ahead. The emotional pull of these preserves lives in memory as much as taste. Grandmothers spread them on hot cornbread. Aunties aunties tucked jars into gift baskets. Children sneaked spoonfuls when backs were turned. It was a dessert of community, of extending the life of joy just a little longer. Today, watermelon rind preserves are nearly extinct, dismissed as old-fashioned or too much work. TikTok celebrates zero-waste recipes like it's a revolution, but Black cooks were practicing that ethic centuries ago. Reviving this dish isn't just about nostalgia. It's about honoring a tradition that knew how to turn scraps into sweetness and scarcity into abundance. The hickory nut cake. Before pecans and walnuts took over the baking aisle, there was the hickory nut, a nut so stubborn to crack that only the truly determined could get to its sweet, buttery treasure. In African American kitchens of the South and Appalachia, determination was in no short supply. From that persistence came hickory nut cake, a dessert that was equal parts indulgence and testament to patience. The recipe itself was straightforward, calling for the usual cake staples: flour, butter, eggs, and sugar. But what set it apart was the handfuls of hickory nuts, painstakingly shelled and folded into the batter. Their flavor was deep and almost smoky, richer than a walnut and earthier than a pecan, which made the cake feel like a delicacy reserved for Sundays, holidays, or special gatherings. Preparing the nuts was its own family affair. Children might be sent outside with hammers or rocks to crack the shells, only to bring back a meager cup of nut meats after hours of work. But that cup was worth its weight in gold. Folded into the batter, the hickory nuts transformed the cake into something unforgettable. Tender crumb laced with crunchy, buttery bursts, crowned often with a simple glaze or dusting of sugar. It was not a flashy dessert, but one that carried the taste of the land, the memory of labor, and the satisfaction of making something rare feel abundant. Hickory nut cake held a place in memory as a seasonal treasure, tied to autumn harvests and holiday tables. Today, though, it has nearly vanished, a casualty of convenience culture. Hickory nuts are hard to find in stores, and few people have the patience to shell them by hand. Yet in its time, the cake was more than food. It was proof that sweetness could be coaxed out of even the hardest shell, a dessert born of effort, love, and resilience. Transparent pie. Transparent pie is one of those desserts whose name tells you almost nothing and yet somehow says it all. A cousin of chess pie, it was born in the kitchens of Kentucky and made its way into African American households where thrift met creativity. Transparent pie was the art of turning the barest of pantry staples, eggs, sugar, butter, and cream, into something that felt like a luxury. The filling baked up pale and glossy, almost glass-like in its sheen, which gave the pie its curious name. Slice into it and you'd find a silky custard that was sweet, rich, and just decadent enough to make a plain Sunday dinner feel like a feast. What made transparent pie special was not complexity but restraint. It didn't need spices or chocolate or fruit to announce itself. It relied on the chemistry of simple ingredients, transforming them into a filling that clung to the crust in a delicate balance of sweetness and texture. The pie was an everyday indulgence for people who rarely had the chance to indulge, and that's what gave it such staying power and memory. Families baked it for holidays or when company came calling, the kind of dessert that brought pride to a table without breaking the budget. For many African American families, transparent pie was also a thread of continuity, a reminder of survival during leaner times. It was proof that scarcity didn't have to taste plain, that even a handful of eggs and sugar could be spun into something celebratory. Grandmothers often kept the recipe tucked away, measured more by instinct than by cups or spoons, and the pie carried with it the weight of tradition. Today, transparent pie is nearly forgotten, overshadowed by flashier custards and store-bought sweets. But in its quiet elegance, it tells the story of making do, and making do beautifully. Old-fashioned chess pie. Chess pie is one of those desserts that feels both plain and profound, a true Southern classic that made its way into African American kitchens where it became a symbol of thrift, sweetness, and tradition. At its heart, it is almost embarrassingly simple. Eggs, sugar, butter, and a little cornmeal or flour to give the custard body. Some versions called for a splash of vinegar or buttermilk to cut the richness, while others leaned fully into the sweetness, creating a filling that baked into a golden, slightly crackled top over a flaky crust. For a dessert that looked unassuming, chess pie carried more weight than its humble appearance suggested. Its origins are a little hazy, but most agree it came from necessity. In times when fruit was scarce and imported luxuries like chocolate or spices were out of reach, cooks leaned on what they had in abundance. Sugar was cheap, cornmeal was always on hand, and eggs came straight from the yard. The result was a pie that didn't just fill plates, but also lifted spirits, a reminder that even the most modest kitchen could turn out something worth gathering around. For African American families, especially during the eras of Reconstruction and the Depression, chess pie became a staple for Sunday dinners and holidays, a dish that balanced scarcity with sweetness. The emotional connection runs deep. Many remember it as the pie their grandmother pulled from the oven, its scent filling the house with a promise of comfort. It was the kind of dessert that didn't need adornment, and perhaps that was the point. Its plainness was its beauty. Today, chess pie has faded into the background, often confused with its flashier cousins like pecan or lemon. But for those who know, a slice of old-fashioned chess pie is a taste of survival, resilience, and quiet joy. Buttermilk pie. Buttermilk pie is one of those desserts that hides in plain sight, overshadowed by louder, flashier cousins like lemon meringue or pecan. But in many African American kitchens, it was once a quiet star. Born out of thrift and necessity, it relied on the humble buttermilk, something always on hand when fresh milk soured faster than it could be used. Instead of waste, cooks saw opportunity. With eggs, sugar, butter, and flour, they transformed that tangy liquid into a custardy filling that baked into a golden crown, rich yet light, simple yet deeply satisfying. The preparation was straightforward, but the magic happened in the oven. The tang of the buttermilk mellowed into a delicate tartness that cut through the sweetness, while the custard set into a silky texture that clung lovingly to the crust. A slice of buttermilk pie never shouted for attention, but it always delivered comfort. For many families, especially during lean years, it was the kind of dessert that turned an ordinary weeknight supper into something memorable. It was proof that simplicity could be indulgent when guided by care and creativity. In African American households, buttermilk pie carried layers of memory. It often appeared at Sunday dinners, family reunions, or church gatherings where it stood alongside caramel cake, pound cake, or sweet potato pie as a beloved staple. Grandmothers and aunties guarded their recipes, each swearing theirs was the real version, measured not by cups, but by instinct, the way tradition was meant to be passed down. Today, buttermilk pie is rarely seen outside of Southern communities, its name sounding almost too plain for modern menus. Yet it deserves revival, not just for its flavor, but for its symbolism. In every slice is a story of resourcefulness, of turning sour into sweet, and of finding joy in the most unassuming places. Caramel cake. Caramel cake was once the undisputed queen of church socials and Sunday dinners, a dessert so rich in memory that its golden layers seemed to glow before you even tasted them. At its heart, it was simple enough: tender yellow cake stacked high and covered in a frosting of cooked sugar, butter, and cream. But that caramel icing, oh, that was the tricky part. It demanded patience, a steady hand, and the kind of watchful eye that could stand over a bubbling pot without flinching. Done right, it set into a glossy, almost fudgy layer that clung to the cake like amber silk. Done wrong, it scorched, seized, or slid right off, leaving behind a sticky mess and a cook muttering under her breath. In African American kitchens, caramel cake was more than dessert. It was a rite of passage. Mothers and grandmothers guarded their techniques, teaching daughters not just the recipe, but the rhythm, when to stir, when to stop, and when to trust the caramel to do its work. The cake carried with it the air of celebration. It appeared at weddings, at holidays, at milestone birthdays. It was too much labor for an ordinary Tuesday, but when it did appear, it spoke volumes. Someone cared enough to give you their time and their skill wrapped in sugar. The emotional resonance is impossible to separate from the flavor. For many, biting into caramel cake is tied to memories of family reunions, laughter spilling from kitchens, and the hum of gospel music in the background. Today, though, it has slipped from common tables, replaced by store-bought sheet cakes or quicker frostings that lack its slow-cooked depth. Still, caramel cake endures as a symbol of patience and pride, a reminder that sometimes sweetness is best when it takes its time. Jam cake. Jam cake is one of those desserts that whispers rather than shouts, a quiet Southern treasure that once held pride of place on African American holiday tables. At first glance, it looked like a simple spice cake, dark and modest, but inside it carried a richness that spoke of both frugality and indulgence. The secret was jam, homemade, most often blackberry or apple, cooked down from summer's harvest and sealed in jars for the cold months ahead, stirred into the batter, along with spices like cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves. The jam gave the cake a dense, moist crumb and a sweetness that deepened with every bite. It was the kind of dessert that tasted like memory itself, pulling you back to summer fields and canning days, even in the heart of winter. Making jam cake was both practical and celebratory. In times when fresh fruit was scarce, preserves stretched the season, ensuring nothing went to waste. African American families, many of whom relied on foraging and farming, knew the value of turning berries into jars of longevity. When those jars were later stirred into cake batter, the result wasn't just dessert, it was proof of resourcefulness, of how yesterday's labor could brighten tomorrow's table. Often finished with a caramel glaze or a swipe of chocolate icing, jam cake was dense, spicy, and unapologetically filling, the kind of cake that seemed to last forever, just like the memories tied to it. Today, jam cake has nearly disappeared, replaced by lighter sponge cakes or supermarket confections that prioritize looks over substance. But in its heyday, it was more than food. It was a bridge between seasons, a way to sweeten hard times, and a dessert that bound families together through the shared work of preserving. In every slice was summer, memory, and resilience. Blackberry dumplings. Blackberry dumplings were the kind of dessert that tasted like summer, the kind of sweet you could smell before you even saw it. Long before grocery store berries came in plastic clamshells, blackberries were foraged from brambles along fences and field edges, often gathered by children with stained fingers and scratched arms. For African American families in the rural South, those wild berries were a free treasure, and nothing showcased them better than a pot of blackberry dumplings. Instead of a neat cobbler baked in a dish, dumplings turned the fruit into something more rustic and communal. Bubbling blackberries simmered with sugar and water until they became a glossy, fragrant syrup, then spoonfuls of dough dropped right on top, puffing up as they cooked in the steam. The result was part pudding, part cobbler, and entirely comfort. The dumplings themselves, soft and fluffy on the outside but soaked with berry syrup on the inside, were a study in contrasts, pillowy bites that melted into tart sweetness with every spoonful. Served warm, often with nothing more than a splash of cream or a drizzle of milk, blackberry dumplings had the power to hush a table into contentment. They were unfussy and filling, a dessert that stretched a handful of berries into a feast for a whole family. More than taste, though, blackberry dumplings carried memory. They were tied to barefoot summers, to laughter on porches, to the unspoken rule that no berry patch went unpicked when it was in season. For many African American families, they symbolized both joy and survival, proof that abundance could be found in the hedgerows if you were willing to reach for it. Today, this dish has nearly disappeared, replaced by quick cobblers or store-bought pies. But in its simplicity, it remains one of the sweetest testaments to summer's generosity. Boiled custard. Before cartons of eggnog lined grocery store shelves in December, there was boiled custard, a holiday tradition in many African American homes that carried with it both warmth and patience. Unlike eggnog, which often came spiked and frothy, boiled custard was gentler, smoother, and more refined, a drinkable dessert that felt like comfort in a glass. Made with milk, sugar, and egg yolks slowly cooked until thick enough to coat the back of a spoon, it required vigilance. Too much heat, and you had sweet scrambled eggs. Too little, and the custard never set. It was a balancing act, and mastering it was considered both a culinary skill and a kind of seasonal rite of passage. For families, boiled custard was more than just a drink. It marked the rhythm of the holidays, a tradition stirred by grandmothers and passed down through generations. Children would wait impatiently as the custard cooled, sneaking tastes with a wooden spoon, while the grown folks debated the proper consistency, some preferring it just thick enough to sip, others wanting it closer to pudding. Often flavored simply with vanilla, sometimes dusted with nutmeg, it was poured into glasses or jars and served chilled, a dessert that refreshed as much as it comforted. The emotional connection to boiled custard ran deep. It was tied to Christmas tables, family reunions, and the quiet moments after a long day of cooking when the house smelled of spice and sugar. In many African American households, households, it carried the echo of resilience, proof that even in lean years, there was always room for sweetness. Today, boiled custard has largely faded from holiday spreads, eclipsed by mass-produced eggnog and quicker desserts. But for those who remember, it remains a symbol of patience, care, and the gentle luxury of time well spent. Prune whip. Prune whip may not sound like the kind of dessert anyone would line up for today, but in its time, it was a small miracle of ingenuity. Born in the Depression era, when frugality was a necessity rather than a lifestyle choice, prune whip transformed what many considered a humble, even unglamorous fruit into something light, airy, and downright elegant. Prunes, often maligned as nothing more than a digestive aid, were stewed until soft and sweet, then whipped together with sugar and beaten egg whites until the mixture took on the texture of a cloud tinted by caramel dusk. The appeal of prune whip was as much about spectacle as it was about taste. Families who had grown accustomed to heavy, filling foods found themselves delighted by a dessert that felt delicate, almost celebratory, even though it cost next to nothing to make. Children marveled at how something dark and wrinkled could be transformed into a shimmering, frothy treat, while adults savored its subtle sweetness, a flavor somewhere between dried fruit and toffee. Sometimes it was served in parfait glasses, layered with cream, to give the illusion of luxury during times when true indulgences were scarce. In African American households, prune whip was remembered less for its glamour than for what it symbolized: resourcefulness, creativity, and to conjure joy from the unlikeliest ingredients. It was the kind of dessert that proved cooking was as much art as survival, a reminder that the kitchen could be a place of hope, even when the world outside was uncertain. Today, prune whip has almost vanished, dismissed as too old-fashioned or too odd. Yet in its airy lightness lies a powerful story. That sweetness is not always about abundance, but about imagination and the will to make do beautifully. Molasses cookies. Molasses cookies were once the steady, dependable sweet that lived in countless African American kitchens, the kind of dessert that didn't need to be flashy to be beloved. In the days before mass-produced snacks filled lunch boxes, these cookies were a homemade staple, baked in batches that filled tin jars and lingered on the counter for anyone passing through. They were chewy at the center, crisp at the edges, and dark with the richness of molasses, that humble syrup which carried so much of the South's culinary history. Molasses was cheaper than refined sugar, more accessible in rural communities, and versatile enough to sweeten everything from pies to candy. In cookies, it added a depth of flavor that no white sugar could match, smoky and bittersweet, like caramel with a touch of earth. The process of making them was straightforward but never careless. Butter or lard creamed with sugar, eggs folded in, and then the star ingredient, molasses, stirred until the dough turned a rich brown. Spices like ginger, cinnamon, and cloves gave each bite warmth, the kind of flavor that lingered on the tongue long after the cookie was gone. Rolled into balls and flattened on baking sheets, they baked into perfect rounds that filled the house with a smell more comforting than any candle could imitate. For children, molasses cookies were energy and comfort in equal measure. They traveled in lunch pails to school or into the fields, sturdy enough to last the day and sweet enough to make the work lighter. For families, they were a ritual, a familiar taste that carried through generations, simple yet full of meaning. Today, they've been pushed aside by chocolate chips and packaged treats, but molasses cookies remain a testament to the beauty of humble ingredients transformed by care and memory. Fruit cobblers. Fruit cobblers were the grand finale of many African American family meals, the kind of dessert that never needed a recipe card to come out just right. They were as flexible as they were beloved, changing with the seasons and with whatever fruit happened to be on hand. In summer, it might be blackberries foraged from the brambles, their tartness mellowed with sugar. In the fall, apples or peaches found their way into the pan, bubbling beneath a crust that could be biscuit-like and sturdy or soft and cake-like, depending on who was in charge of the kitchen. What tied all versions together was the comfort they brought, a bubbling dish of sweetened fruit crowned with dough, served warm and fragrant, spooned straight into waiting bowls. Cobblers were more than dessert, they were communal events. In African American households, debates often broke out over which version was the right one. Some swore by a biscuit topping, dropped in rough rough mounds that browned beautifully in the oven, while others stood firmly in the camp of the pour-over batter method, which baked into a golden, pudding-like crust. Neither side was wrong, but family loyalty could make it sound like a theological debate. Regardless of the method, cobblers were always generous, stretching fruit to feed a crowd, making sure no one left the table hungry. The memory of cobbler is inseparable from its setting. Church homecomings, Sunday dinners, reunions where the pan was scraped clean before the last guest left. It was a dessert that carried the taste of the land, of seasons marked by what ripened nearby. Today, cobblers risk being overshadowed by more polished pies and store-bought sweets, but their soul endures. In every bubbling dish lies proof that food made to share is food that lasts far beyond the meal itself. Rice pudding. Rice pudding was the kind of dessert that turned thrift into comfort, proof that yesterday's leftovers could become today's sweetness with a little imagination. In African American households, it often began with a pot of rice cooked for dinner, stretched to feed a family. Rather than letting it go to waste, cooks folded in milk, sugar, eggs, and spices until the plain grains transformed into something rich and satisfying. Baked low and slow, the pudding emerged with a golden top and a custardy interior, fragrant with cinnamon, nutmeg, and sometimes a splash of vanilla. Each spoonful carried both warmth and substance, hearty enough to be filling yet sweet enough to count as a treat. The dish carried particular weight during lean times. In eras when money was tight, rice pudding made the most of what was already on hand, proving that comfort didn't require extravagance. African American families leaned on it not only for its frugality, but for the sense of continuity it provided. Generations passed down variations. Some added raisins or bits of fruit. Others preferred it plain, letting the cream and spice speak for themselves. The method was never rigid. It was guided by memory, instinct, and the rhythm of the kitchen. For children, rice pudding was often tied to moments of warmth. The scent drifting from the oven, a bowl pressed into their hands on a chilly evening, or the gentle scrape of a spoon against the casserole dish when everyone reached for seconds. For adults, it was a reminder that sweetness could emerge from the simplest staples. Today, rice pudding is often overlooked in favor of flashier desserts, but its legacy remains strong. It is a dish that proves abundance can be found in simplicity, and that comfort sometimes comes disguised as leftovers. Potato candy. Potato candy sounds like a joke, the sort of thing someone might invent on a dare. Yet for many African American families in the South, it was a sweet born of both frugality and genius. At its heart, it was a candy made from mashed potato, powdered sugar, and peanut butter. Three ingredients that hardly seemed destined for dessert, but when combined, created something memorable. The potato provided the base, bland and starchy, a canvas on which sugar could work its magic. With each cup of powdered sugar kneaded in, the mixture transformed from humble mash into a pliable dough, pale and sweet, ready to be rolled out. Spread with a layer of peanut butter, it was then rolled into a log and sliced into pinwheels, each piece a swirl of creamy richness wrapped in unexpected simplicity. For children, potato candy was almost a miracle. How could something as plain as a potato become this sweet, this fun to eat? The process itself felt playful, rolling, spreading, slicing, and the result looked as delightful as it tasted. For families living through hard times, it was proof that dessert didn't need expensive ingredients to feel indulgent. Potatoes were cheap, sugar was a pantry staple, and peanut butter stretched far when used sparingly. Together, they created candy that could be shared at holidays, church socials, or simply as a treat on a long afternoon. What lingers in memory is not just the flavor, but the spirit of the dish. Potato candy represented resourcefulness, the ability to surprise joy out of the ordinary. Today, it has nearly vanished, overshadowed by store-bought chocolates and glossy confections. Yet in its sticky sweetness lives a powerful story that sometimes the most unlikely ingredients can roll themselves into comfort, celebration, and family lore. Divinity candy. Divinity candy was the kind of sweet that felt almost otherworldly, which explains its name. Pure white, airy, and flecked with nuts, it looked like a cloud you could hold in your hand, though anyone who had ever tried to make it knew there was nothing simple about this candy. In African American households across the South, divinity was often reserved for the holidays, not because ingredients were costly. Sugar, egg whites, corn syrup, and vanilla vanilla were straightforward enough, but because making it demanded patience, timing, and a little bit of faith. One wrong move and you ended up with sticky taffy or grainy sugar instead of the silky, marshmallow-like confection that was the goal. The process began with boiling sugar syrup to the perfect stage. No candy thermometer required in those days, just the practiced eye and touch of a seasoned cook. Meanwhile, egg whites were whipped until stiff peaks formed, ready to be married with the molten syrup. As the sugar poured in, the mixture thickened and lightened, turning glossy and snow white. Pecans or walnuts were folded in at the end, each piece dropped by the spoonful onto wax paper to set. Children would hover at the edges of the kitchen, wide-eyed, waiting for the first cooled bite, though more often than not, they were shooed away with warnings not to ruin the candy by breathing too close in the humid air. Divinity candy carried emotional weight because it was as much about the ritual as the taste. It was tied to Christmas gatherings, to tables crowded with cakes and pies, with these little clouds nestled in tins as gifts. Today, it is rarely made, deemed too fussy in an age of convenience, yet its very difficulty was part of its beauty, a reminder that some sweetness must be earned. Lane cake. Lane cake was never just a dessert, it was a statement. Tall, layered, and unapologetically rich, it made its way into African-American kitchens in the early 20th century and quickly earned a reputation as both a celebration cake and a bit of a scandal. At its base, it was a white sponge cake, light and tender, but what made Lane cake unforgettable was the filling, a boozy concoction of egg yolks, butter, sugar, and a riot of add-ins like raisins, pecans, coconut, and most importantly, whiskey or brandy. This wasn't the kind of cake that whispered politely at the table. It announced itself with bold flavors and a fragrance that hinted at the secret splash from the liquor cabinet. Preparing a Lane cake was no small feat. It took time, patience, and a steady hand, especially when cooking the custard filling that would bind the layers together. Families often saved it for holidays, weddings, or homecomings, moments when something extravagant felt necessary. In African-American communities, the cake carried with it the air of abundance, a rare treat that proved even modest kitchens could turn out grandeur with the right mix of ingenuity and care. Its reputation for being a little grown-up only added to the allure. Children might get a slice, but the adults knew the deeper pleasure lay in the warmth of the filling's secret ingredient. Lane cake's emotional pull came from its place at the center of gatherings. It was the cake people remembered, the one that got talked about long after the dishes were cleared. Today, it has mostly slipped from memory, too labor-intensive for modern schedules, too old-fashioned for trendy dessert menus. But in its day, Lane cake stood as a proud emblem of celebration, defiance, and the sweet taste of occasion. Red Devil cake. Red Devil cake was the showstopper long before its younger, trendier cousin Red Velvet stole the spotlight. Dark, dramatic, and rich with chocolate, it earned its name from its deep reddish hue, a color that came not from bottles of food dye, but from the natural reaction of cocoa with acidic ingredients like buttermilk or vinegar. In African-American households, especially during the mid-20th century, Red Devil cake became a centerpiece for birthdays, church socials, and holiday tables. It was a cake that felt indulgent, a little mischievous even, with its bold color and velvety crumb, but still rooted in the practicality of pantry staples. Baking Red Devil cake was both science and ritual. Cocoa, sugar, flour, and eggs formed the base, but it was the combination of buttermilk and vinegar that gave the cake its signature texture and hint of tang. Layered high and often paired with a creamy frosting, sometimes cooked, sometimes butter-based. It wasn't just about taste, but presentation. This was the kind of cake that drew eyes when carried into a room, its rich slices promising a decadence that everyday desserts couldn't match. For African-American families, Red Devil cake was more than food. It was memory baked into layers. It represented the pride of bringing a cake that looked as impressive as it tasted, the joy of sharing something that felt special even when times weren't easy. Children remembered sneaking fingerfuls of frosting, while adults recalled the laughter around tables where slices disappeared faster than they could be served. Today, Red Devil cake has largely faded into obscurity, eclipsed by the Instagram fame of brightly dyed red velvet. But in its quiet disappearance lies a story of resilience and and creativity, proof that long before food trends, there were cakes that carried both beauty and soul. Coconut custard pie. Coconut custard pie was once a jewel of the holiday table, the kind of dessert that signaled a special occasion had arrived. In African American kitchens, it was a sweet that carried both elegance and thrift, using humble ingredients like eggs, sugar, milk, and shredded coconut to create something that felt like a luxury. The filling was silky and rich, balanced between custard and cream, while the coconut lent it both texture and a whisper of the exotic. Before coconuts were easily available in every grocery store, they were considered a splurge, and when one found its way into a kitchen, it was used with reverence. Cracking open a coconut, grating the meat by hand, and folding it into custard was an act of both labor and love. The pie baked into a golden crown, the coconut rising to the top to form a lightly toasted layer that contrasted with the creamy custard beneath. Served chilled or at room temperature, each slice offered a taste that was both comforting and indulgent. Sweet enough to satisfy, but restrained enough to leave you reaching for another bite. Families often brought coconut custard pie to church dinners or reunions, where it competed for attention with pound cake and caramel cake, holding its own with quiet confidence. The memories tied to coconut custard pie were as rich as its filling. Grandmothers proudly presented it at Christmas or Easter. Mothers saved it for Sundays when guests came, and children learned early that this was not an everyday pie, but a treasure for moments that mattered. Today, it has nearly disappeared, overshadowed by coconut cream pie with its towering whipped topping, or by store-bought shortcuts. But the old coconut custard pie remains a testament to patience, celebration, and the joy of turning something rare into something unforgettable. 7-Up cake. The 7-Up cake was a marvel of mid-century creativity, a dessert that showed how African American cooks could take something as ordinary as a bottle of soda and transform it into something extraordinary. At first glance, it might seem like just another pound cake, golden and dense, but the secret ingredient was a splash of lemon-lime soda mixed right into the batter. The carbonation helped the cake rise, while the soda's citrus tang gave it a brightness that balanced the richness of butter and sugar. It was innovation in a bundt pan, proof that resourcefulness and curiosity often lead to the best recipes. The cake was especially popular in the 1950s and 60s, when convenience foods and brand name products were working their way into everyday kitchens. Advertisers promised that modern living meant easy baking, but African American households often took these products and gave them a soulful twist. The 7-Up cake became a fixture at reunions, church picnics, and Sunday dinners, its moist crumb and lemon glaze shining in the center of the dessert table. For children, it was a treat that tasted both familiar and new, while adults appreciated its lightness compared to heavier cakes. Making the cake wasn't difficult, which helped it spread quickly through neighborhoods and communities. Butter was creamed with sugar, eggs folded in, flour beaten carefully, and then came the 7-Up, its fizz mingling with the batter in a way that felt almost magical. Topped with a simple glaze of powdered sugar and lemon juice, it was sweet, tangy, and satisfying without being fussy. Today, 7-Up cake has mostly slipped into nostalgia, remembered fondly but rarely baked in an era of instant desserts and viral recipes. Yet its story remains one of playful ingenuity, a reminder that joy can be found in the simplest experiments of the kitchen. Pound cake. Pound cake has always been more than just a dessert. It has been a symbol of abundance, stability, and pride in African American kitchens. Its name comes from its original proportions: 1 pound each of butter, sugar, eggs, and flour, a formula so simple and balanced that it became the backbone of countless family gatherings. Dense yet tender, with a crumb that seemed to melt on the tongue, pound cake was the kind of sweet that carried gravitas. It didn't need frosting or embellishment to command respect. Its richness spoke for itself. In many families, pound cake was a measure of skill. To bake one properly meant you had mastered patience, precision, and the subtle rhythm of the kitchen. The creaming of butter and sugar, the careful incorporation of eggs, the steady folding of flour. Each step had to be done with care, and you could taste it if shortcuts were taken. A perfectly baked pound cake emerged golden brown with a crack running down the middle like a signature. That split was considered beautiful, a mark mark of authenticity, a sign that the cake had risen with dignity. For African American families, pound cake held a place of honor at reunions, funerals, and Sunday dinners. It was the cake that traveled well, that sliced neatly into generous pieces, that filled bellies and hearts without pretense. It was also the cake most likely to be baked by the matriarch, wrapped in foil, and carried across town as both offering and comfort. Memories of it are tied to kitchens warm with the smell of butter and sugar, to voices gathered around tables, to the satisfaction of something made with love and intention. Today, pound cake has been eclipsed by trendier sweets, but it endures as a timeless reminder that the simplest recipes often hold the deepest roots. Peanut brittle. Peanut brittle was once the candy that turned ordinary kitchens into arenas of daring and delight. It wasn't the kind of sweet you could rush or fake. It demanded courage, timing, and just the right touch. In African American households, especially in the South, peanut brittle was a holiday ritual, a confection that carried both danger and reward. The sugar syrup had to be cooked until it reached the hard crack stage, bubbling and hissing in the pot like molten glass. Children were warned to keep their distance, but they watched wide-eyed as their mothers or grandmothers stirred in butter, a dash of baking soda, and finally the peanuts, transforming the mixture into a fragrant golden brown lava. The pouring was a performance all its own. The searing hot candy was spread across a greased pan or cast iron skillet, and then came the race against time to smooth it before it hardened into an immovable sheet. Within minutes, it cooled into a glossy slab that was broken into jagged, bite-sized shards. Each piece carried the smoky sweetness of caramelized sugar, the salty crunch of peanuts, and the faint taste of risk, as if the candy itself remembered the danger of its making. Peanut brittle wasn't just a treat, it was a gift. Families often packed it into tins or jars to share with neighbors and church members, a homemade token of care during Christmas or special gatherings. It was candy that stuck in your teeth, that snapped loudly between bites, that somehow managed to taste both humble and indulgent. Today, peanut brittle is easy to buy in bags in the store, but those lack the character of the homemade kind. The old brittle carried with it the story of skill and resilience, proof that even boiling sugar could be tamed into sweetness with patience and love. Pull taffy. Pull taffy was never just candy. It was an event, a sticky, laughter-filled ritual that brought families together in kitchens across the South. In African American households, especially during the colder months, making taffy was a way to turn sugar, butter, and molasses or corn syrup into an afternoon of fun. The process began with boiling the mixture until it reached just the right stage, then pouring it onto greased pans to cool. What happened next was where the magic and the chaos began. Everyone who could stand the heat gathered around, greasing their hands with butter or oil before grabbing a lump of the warm candy. Then came the pulling, stretching the glossy ropes over and over, folding and twisting until the dull brown mass lightened into a golden, shiny confection. The candy itself was chewy, sweet, and a little sticky, but the taste was almost secondary to the experience of making it. Children shrieked with delight as strings of taffy stretched from their fingers, sometimes more on their faces and clothes than in their mouths. Parents and grandparents turned the work into play, laughing as the candy snapped or tangled, reminding everyone that desserts didn't always have to be neat or perfect to be joyous. Pull taffy was a social dessert, one that required time, patience, and more than a little cooperation, making it as much about bonding as about eating. For many, the memory of pull taffy is tied not just to its flavor, but to the warmth of those gatherings. The chatter around the table, the sticky fingers, the shared pride when the candy was finally ready to be cut into bite-sized pieces. Today, it has all but disappeared, replaced by store-bought treats. But its legacy remains as a reminder that sometimes the sweetest memories are the messiest ones. Ambrosia. Ambrosia was once the crown jewel of holiday tables, a dessert that glowed with the promise of luxury even though its ingredients were deceptively simple. In African American households across the South, it often appeared at Christmas or Easter, gleaming in cut glass bowls, a mixture of fruit and shredded coconut layered in sweetness. At its most traditional, ambrosia was little more than fresh orange slices, their juice mingling with sugar, topped with grated coconut. Later versions folded in pineapple, bananas, or even marshmallows and whipped cream, but the essence of ambrosia was always about making something bright and refreshing. refreshing out of what was available. To understand ambrosia's appeal, you have to imagine the era before refrigeration and supermarkets stocked year-round produce. Citrus was a winter delicacy, sometimes shipped from Florida, and coconuts were exotic treasures that took real labor to crack and shred. When these rare ingredients came together, the result felt extravagant, a celebration in a bowl. For African American families, serving ambrosia was an act of joy and pride, proof that a special day deserved something beyond the ordinary. Children would sneak spoonfuls when no one was looking, while adults carefully rationed it, making sure every guest received a taste. The emotional resonance of ambrosia comes not only from its flavor, but from its place in memory. It was the dish that brightened a winter table, the sweet counterpoint to heavy holiday meats, the dessert that seemed almost magical in its simplicity. Today, ambrosia has fallen out of fashion, often dismissed as too old-fashioned or overshadowed by more elaborate sweets. Yet in its time, it represented abundance, ingenuity, and celebration. A spoonful of ambrosia was more than fruit and coconut. It was sunshine captured in a bowl, a reminder of joy in its purest form. Fig pudding. Fig pudding may sound like something plucked from the pages of a Dickens novel, but in African American households of the South, it once held a cherished place at the holiday table. Dense, dark, and rich, it was a dessert that carried with it both the memory of older traditions and the practicality of making the most of preserved fruit. At its core, fig pudding was a steamed or baked dish made from dried figs, eggs, milk, sugar, and breadcrumbs or flour, bound together with spice and often finished with a sauce of caramel or brandy. Unlike the airy cakes that would later dominate dessert tables, fig pudding was substantial, almost weighty, a sweet meant to anchor a celebration. The preparation required patience, as puddings often steamed for hours, filling the kitchen with the earthy perfume of figs and spices. For families who grew their own fruit or foraged when the season was right, figs were a prized ingredient, dried and stored to bring sweetness to the winter months. Folding them into pudding turned a humble ingredient into something festive, a dessert that announced a day was worth remembering. In many African American homes, fig pudding appeared at Christmas or New Year's, carrying echoes of both Southern and older European traditions, but adapted with the flavors and methods available in Black kitchens. The memories tied to fig pudding were layered with warmth. Children watched anxiously as the pudding was unmolded, steam rising like a curtain to reveal the glossy dome beneath. Adults savored its richness slowly, each bite a reminder of how scarcity could be transformed into abundance with care. Today, fig pudding has nearly vanished, overshadowed by flashier cakes and pies, but it remains a quiet emblem of patience, celebration, and the art of turning preservation into joy. Coca-Cola cake. Coca-Cola cake was born in an era when brand names began sneaking their way into family kitchens, but in African American households, it became more than a clever recipe. It became a symbol of celebration. Imagine taking a bottle of the South's most famous soda and pouring it straight into a mixing bowl. What could have been a gimmick turned into genius. The carbonation gave the batter a light lift, the syrupy sweetness deepened the chocolate, and the result was a cake that was moist, rich, and unexpectedly elegant. It was the kind of dessert that showed up at birthdays, reunions, and Sunday suppers, and when it hit the table, you knew it was a special day. The process was simple but carried its own kind of magic. Butter, sugar, flour, and cocoa came together with eggs and a generous splash of Coca-Cola, creating a batter that smelled like a promise even before it hit the oven. While the cake baked, a hot fudge-like frosting was prepared, often poured over the cake while it was still warm so that it soaked into the crumb, making each bite dense with flavor. Sometimes nuts or marshmallows were scattered on top, making it even more indulgent. For children, it was a marvel. Soda turned into dessert. For adults, it was a clever way to take an ordinary product and elevate it into something worth sharing. The emotional pull of Coca-Cola cake was tied to its place at gatherings. It was often the centerpiece of the dessert table, a dish that invited conversation and second helpings. Today, it has nearly disappeared, forgotten in the shadow of easier, boxed cakes and trendier sweets. Yet its legacy lingers as a reminder of mid-century creativity and and the joy of turning everyday ingredients into celebration. And there you have it, 30 desserts once loved in African American kitchens, now mostly forgotten, but still rich with history and soul. From simple sweets born of hard times to the showstoppers of church socials, each one carries a story worth remembering and reviving. If any of these brought back memories or maybe sparked your curiosity to try them for the first time, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who loves a little food nostalgia, and subscribe for more stories that bring the past back to the table